Welcome to Die Hard on a Blank, the podcast where we explore the influence of Die Hard on action cinema, one action movie at a time. I'm Philip Gawthorne, and with me as always is Liam Billingham, and today's film is Terminal Velocity.
It's Die Hard in a skydiving spy caper. What a mouthful. Lot going on in that.
We're having to perform increasing levels of gymnastics to
It's almost like we're skydiving to figure out where we are in the show.
Crowbar in these Die Hard on a Blanks.
Well, it's getting further and further afield. How you doing, Phil?
I'm very good. I'm very excited to talk about this movie with our special guest, Rob Hackett, who is a friend of mine. He's a producer for James Wan's company, Atomic Monster, and just a fellow cinephile with a lot to say about Die Hard and a lot to say about this movie. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Oh, thanks, guys, for having me.
Hey, Rob. How you doing?
I'm doing okay.
How's your Wednesday?
It's better now that I get to talk about terminal velocity. Come on.
So charming.
Yeah, there you go.
It's better now.
So let's dive in with the burning question, and I know that you've got some really, really interesting stuff to say about this.
Do you skydive and how often?
Rob, what's your personal history with Die Hard?
It's a long one. When I was 6 years old, I saw it at a friend's house, and it was one of those houses where anything goes, and I remember my friend's mom rented it for him and his older sisters, and I was over there, and they put it on. And I was just, it was like a lightning bolt struck me. And I literally came online. And I had no idea, and I didn't have a vocabulary for what I was watching.
Right.
But it literally imprinted on me. And I've now literally spent the majority of my life and my career kind of trying to unpack why it had such an influence on me. And anyway, it had such an influence on me that I have a 4-year-old daughter, and her middle name is McLean. And so, which was
Phil, your move.
yeah. And so, anyway, the funny story about that is one of our twins' name is her middle name is McAllister, because my wife's favorite movie is Home Alone.
Oh,
which, by the way,
Die
is
Hard in a Christmas movie.
In more ways than it is the same movie, right?
Yeah.
So, but anyway, in unpacking it, the thing I sort of realized is, at a young age, we're all looking for sort of a way to relate to our parents and our parents with us. And when my parents discovered that I had seen the movie, rather than shame me or discipline me, my dad especially was like, he kind of nurtured my interest in the movie. And it became a thing that we could talk about. And as I got older, you guys have literally covered up to this point pretty much every movie my dad and I saw in the theater. And it became kind of a common language.
Target audience.
That's right. That's right. And so, ever since then, it's just been something I've sort of been chasing because it had such an influence on me.
Cool.
Wow.
Yeah, it's very relatable. I mean, I think my dad showed me Die Hard.
Yeah, there you go.
Because it was inappropriately, but he was like, I don't care.
It was like a rite of passage, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It had that quality, too.
Did you guys go and see Terminal Velocity together, you and your dad?
We did. Yeah, I remember specifically opening night. I'd seen the trailer, which, by the way, the movie has an incredible trailer. And I remember we saw it, and I was doing that thing. I mean, I would have been 10 or 11 at the time. I did the thing where I sat in front of my parents. So I remember I went with my mom and my dad, and I sat in front of them. But I remember the audience was full that night, and people just ate the movie up.
Oh, that's the best.
Yeah. I remember vividly my experience of watching the movie, and I was like, it just delivered on everything I didn't even know I wanted. I was like, parachutes, check. Ejecting out of inexplicable rocket cars, check. I was like, where did all this come from?
James Gandolfini doing a New Jersey and Russian accent, check.
Exactly.
Classic. Phil, what's your relationship with Terminal Velocity?
I'm coming to it fairly fresh because I watched it
Only seen it 20 times.
No, not at all. I'd actually only seen it once.
Yeah.
Half of it as a kid. We'd rented it. I'll tell this story. We might have to cut this out. So the true story is I was at a buddy of mine's house, and we were, I don't know, like mid-teens when this movie came out, something like that. And we rented the movie. And his older sister's boyfriend bought us alcohol for the first time. So the second half of the
Stop
movie
recording.
was not watched. basically
Y'all fall
because
asleep?
we discovered the joys of an alco-pop called Hooch that we were too young to be drinking.
Listening to this sentence.
And we, our interest went in another direction. So I'd only got up to the point where Gandolfini showed up.
Okay.
So the rest of the movie was a mystery to me. So it was fun to come at it fresh today. Did you see this one when it?
No, I just saw it for the first time 2 nights ago. I vaguely remember it. I had a picky father. I feel like there were like people on his list of like, I'm not watching their movies. And I don't think Charlie Sheen was on it, but I don't know. It like passed us by. It's fair to remember this is 1994 and like there's a banger every few weeks.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
it never.
The bar was high.
I do remember the VHS tape in the action section of the video store.
Yeah.
Very, very clearly. So I was glad to check it out when I did the other night for this podcast. Phil, can we get some facts, some fast facts, some top-line facts about the film
Let's do
Terminal Velocity?
So this movie had its wide release on September 23rd of 1994, which was approximately 6 weeks after our last film, Clear and Present Danger. Now 6 years after Die Hard. It was an original screenplay by David Twohy, who we mentioned previously because he was one of the writers on The Fugitive and went on to do a lot of very interesting work, which we'll talk about. It was directed by Deran Sarafian. It stars Charlie Sheen, Nastassja Kinski, James Gandolfini, and Christopher McDonald. And on an estimated budget of $50 million, it grossed $47 million. I have a question. How the fuck did this movie cost $50 million if Speed cost $35? Someone explain that to me.
Cars aren't cheap, and having them fall out of airplanes is expensive. I don't know.
I honestly cannot explain how this movie cost that. I was actually trying to work it out. Like, how much would you have spent on talent? $5 million, maybe. We know what Keanu got for Speed, right? Which was $1 million. We talked about it in the Speed episode. Sandra Bullock got $400,000. Maximum this cast is costing, let's even say 10. And $10 million for the stunt at the end. Where did the rest of the money go? And there's no cast in this movie. There's only 10 speaking parts.
I was actually thinking at some point, there's kind of a bare minimum of people in this. Yeah. Like when they're in that power plant or when they're in that, and I was like, there's 4 people here. It actually feels sparse.
Rob, you're a producer. Explain it.
I think shooting in Arizona was probably expensive.
Okay.
I think you're probably importing crew and you're housing a lot of people there.
Okay.
And I do think one of the things I appreciate about the movie is so much of it is in camera. It is a very practical based movie. That stuff costs a lot of money.
Yeah, it costs a lot of money.
You're building a lot of things. Those stunts, I know they did a ton of that aerial work there in Arizona. It was, that stuff costs money.
We should say each episode of the show costs $4.5 million to produce.
Just my salary.
But Phil, you're not wrong. If you have those
talent,
if you have those marquee names, you have to question whether you're spending that.
These t-shirts Phil buys, they don't they
pay for themselves.
Yeah, exactly. This Drive t-shirt cost $8 million.
Now, Rob, you've worked with this filmmaker on Swamp Thing. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
What's your read on him? Because he's an interesting figure with quite an interesting Hollywood lineage, right?
Fascinating guy. And, Darren's dad was Richard Sarafian, who directed Vanishing Point, which, I think everybody out here sort of has a touchstone for that movie. And his uncle is Robert Altman. And so, his
uncle is Robert Altman?
His uncle is Robert Altman.
Wow.
Yeah. And so he grew up on these sets. He traveled with his dad when his dad was making movies. And, his brothers, they were all raised in Hollywood.
Did his dad work on any of the Altman movies?
He acted in them.
Oh,
his dad was a director and an actor. I'm sure you've seen him before.
Which ones do you know which ones I'm a big Altman guy.
I'd have to go back and look. But you would recognize his father.
McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Die Hard on a Snowy Reservation. What?
Put it on the maybe pile.
Yeah, and it's
my ideas aren't supported here.
He had a lot of Darren would tell me stories about, being a PA on the original Halloween.
Wow.
When they were shooting in Pasadena.
Yeah.
And he actually told me he was a camera assistant on the original Die Hard. And he was telling me stories about being on the roof of the building when they had the helicopters flying around and how sort of intense and scary that experience was. And, he was just he really cut his teeth as forgive me, Darren, but he was directing a lot of Italian schlock, and he was also acting in some of these like crazy zombie knockoffs in the late 80s.
Wow.
And he gets this crazy
Guy should write a book.
Yeah,
he should write a book.
Fascinating dude.
Yeah.
And he does Death Warrant, the Jean-Claude Van Damme movie, which is, was a success.
Yeah.
He made it for nothing, and it's actually very impressively directed.
That's why he got $50 million for this movie. He was like, I have to make up for it on Death Warrant.
Well, I think Darren would be honest about this. Like, my guess is he was not the first choice to direct this movie, and it was an expensive spec sale. Well,
I gather that at one point Kevin Reynolds was circling the project or was attached, and they were trying to get Tom Cruise for the lead, and there was some difficulty casting the part, which we'll talk about when we get to that section. But as you've just brought up Deran Sarafian's connection to Die Hard, that brings us rather elegantly to
Die Hard DNA.
So please feel free to add any more if you spot any connections between the two movies. That's a great one right off the top. I had slick European bad guys. We always enjoy them in a 90s action movie.
Slick is an interesting word to use to describe James Gandolfini as a Russian.
I was thinking more Christopher McDonald, who I kind of dig his vibe. Like the blonde hair. He's,
you actually dyed your hair blonde to record this podcast. That's an interesting choice.
I would have thought you'd appreciated that because he's obviously Mr. Joshua in this movie.
Yes.
Oh, that's true. He is a Mr. Joshua.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. Goddamn Christmas!
You need a bleached blonde henchman in an 80s or 90s action movie. So, there's that. It has the same editor as Die Hard, Frank J. Urosti, legendary editor. The same DP as Die Hard 2, Oliver Wood.
Rest in peace. Passed away recently.
Recently
he shot
lost
Face
him.
Off as well, didn't he?
Is that right?
I think he did.
I'd have to check. It also, speaking of Oliver Wood, it features a recreation of the iconic ejector seat shot from Die Hard 2 in the scene where they jump out of the rocket car. So I almost wonder that must have been part of the thinking of why he was hired. And it begins with that shot with the 747 that's very Die Hard 2. And when I was watching it, because I wasn't sure how much Die Hard DNA there was in this movie, and when I listened to the score, I was like, oh, great, it's Michael Kamen. And then I was, oh, no, hang on a minute. Is it Alan Silvestri?
It sounds so much like Lethal Weapon.
It's exactly
crazy how much it sounds like.
Especially the desert stuff in Lethal Weapon.
Exactly, yep.
Right? And this is a desert set
string
movie.
part that just kind of keeps going. Absolutely.
But it's actually composed by Joel McNeely. Any other Die Hard DNA?
And one thing just to say, I think, Arizona was chosen, as you probably know, a lot of Die Hard 2 was shot in the desert, in the Mojave Desert. All the plane miniature and the airport miniature stuff was shot
in Die Hard 2.
In Die Hard Part 2. And so, there was even shots I was wondering if they literally stole them from Die Hard 2 with some of the planes landing. I went back to watch Die Hard 2 to see if they just pulled the shots. They didn't, but I have a feeling that's why he was chosen, is he has so much experience with that stuff.
Interesting, yeah. So even though, again, it's one of those ones where on face value, you might be thinking, this is kind of a stretch, but put it under the microscope. And the Die Hard DNA is always there, baby.
There.
Let's take a quick break, and then we'll dive into our next section, Anatomy of an Action Movie, and we'll unpack this bad boy.
This season, Instacart has your back to school. As in, they've got your back to school lunch favorites like snack packs and fresh fruit. And they've got your back to school supplies like backpacks, binders, and pencils. And they've got your back when your kid casually tells you they have a huge school project due tomorrow. Let's face it, we were all that kid. So first call your parents to say, I'm sorry. And then download the Instacart app to get delivery in as fast as 30 minutes all school year long. Get a $0 delivery fee for your first 3 orders while supplies last. Minimum $10 per order. Additional terms apply.
We're back with our section Anatomy of an Action Movie, where we list the tenets.
We live in a twilight
world, and there are no friends at death. Of the action movie we're talking about, Terminal Velocity. Phil?
Yes.
Will you take us through the premise?
Yes. So here's what I've got for the premise, which I did remember to write down this week after my snafu on True Lies. After a mysterious woman named Chris Morrow, brackets, Nastassja Kinski. Is it Natasha or Nastassja? How should I say it?
It's the latter.
It's Natasha. I don't know how to say it. All right, I'll do my best. Seemingly falls to her death during an attempted tandem parachute jump. Daredevil skydiver Ditch Brodie, brackets, Charlie Sheen, is deemed to be responsible. When Ditch begins his own investigation into what really happened, he finds himself plunged into a deadly world of international espionage, where nothing is what it seems.
I just real quick, I can imagine they're about to roll and they're like, David, we really need a name for Charlie Sheen in this movie. And he looks and he sees a ditch and he's like, Ditch. And then he looks and sees a poster for Jaws and he's like, Brodie, Ditch Brodie. His name is Ditch Brodie.
I like a weird character name.
Such
a
90s action movie name. Oh my goodness.
I dig Ditch. Get it? I've just hanging myself.
Right, moving on. Central population Phil. Rob, you're a fan of this movie.
Yeah, you could call me that. Yeah.
How many times have you seen it?
I've probably seen it 30 or 40 times. It's one of my comfort movies.
Wow.
Whoa. Okay.
Everyone,
so what is it about Terminal Velocity that does it for you?
It's sort of gleefully absurd.
Uh-huh.
Like, the movie doesn't take itself too seriously.
Yes.
And so I find it easier to sink into a movie like that, especially if you've seen it many times.
Mm-hmm.
There's different levels to the experience, right? Once you get past sort of the visceral quality of it, you're just like, oh, I can laugh at the stupidity of the characters or just the absurdity of where the plot goes. Mm-hmm. And I just find the movie incredibly watchable.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
So it's a comfort blanket movie for you. One, obviously you mentioned you saw it growing up and you've had that sort of long-standing attachment to it. Do you get something new out of it as you've watched it more and more times, or is it just more like this is just something there's a nostalgic warm and fuzziness to it? Or
it's definitely that, and there is something that you get new out of it every time as sort of my awareness and my understanding of filmmaking kind of becomes more and more mature. And I do feel like on some level the movie was fairly groundbreaking, though underappreciated for some of the things that it was doing. I think it's, first and foremost, I think on a technical level, it's very impressive. Mm-hmm. Even when I was watching it the other night in preparation for this, I was like, man, this is extremely well put together.
Yeah, I agree.
It's just very slick. And a lot of that is a credit to, some of the names you've read off, including Deran and that budget. And I also, but I also think it's challenging certain paradigms of movies that I really grew up loving. Like, first, beyond Die Hard, Romancing the Stone.
Yeah, I love Romancing the Stone.
Yeah, I think it's literally taking that movie
it's a great shout,
and flipping the sort of traditional gender roles of genre filmmaking up to that point. And she's like, driving the car for most of this movie. And that was extremely rare.
Yeah.
And I don't think you saw it again until, I'm sure you guys are covering it, Long Kiss Goodnight, which this movie really resembles.
Yeah, interesting. That's really interesting. I mean, I mentioned during the True Lies episode that I struggle a bit with light-hearted spy capers.
Phil can't have fun, you guys.
That's right.
It's not the Philly special to have a good time.
Yeah, so this is not necessarily my cup of tea because it's more as I said, I like this sort of hot techno-realism of a spy caper, but we'll talk about more about that in the humor section. But what I love when you mentioned, Liam, when you put it through your microscope, that there was a noir vibe to this.
Yeah.
That's cool.
So I was watching this for the first time, and I texted Phil at some point, and I was like, I think this movie is great and dumb. And those two things are like, something can be great and dumb. Like, there's plenty of dumb things that I love. And there's some great movies that are dumb. True Lies, it's a pretty dumb movie, but it's great. But one of the things that occurred to me watching this is I thought about a couple things from the early 90s. I thought about The Rocketeer. Yeah. Just in the kind of setting and the daredevil and the falling out of the sky. That's
a great comp. There's a swashbuckling quality to this that has. Yeah. I totally see that.
And I love that movie.
Yeah, me too.
It's like a top. In another world, we'd be covering it, but it's not quite a Die Hard corollary. But also movies like Red Rock West or U-Turn, which is going to come 5 years later. And you can't get Red Rock West anywhere. It's so hard to find at screens of the New Beverly once a year, or regularly. And so I've not seen it maybe since I probably inappropriately saw it in the 90s. And there's this kind of and I guess we'll talk about this when we get further into our section, but there's a film noir quality to this that I think is really, really interesting. Should we just jump right into our hero?
Yeah.
Charlie Sheen as Ditch Brodie. Ditch Brodie.
Yeah, I mean, it does speak to that, right? Because he is in narratively, I'd say just bridging this conversation to the hero, right? Narratively, it's noir. It's not, the vibe is not noir. The vibe is, to me, like spy movie. But what's actually happening is a sort of dolt who is kind of dull. In the sense he's dull in the head, right? He's not the sharpest tool in the box. gets
he receives
drawn,
an assignment, essentially,
meets a femme fatale,
right,
and is drawn into a world of intrigue and plays detective, crudely, right? That is the definition of a film noir premise, even though this movie vibe-wise feels like something else. But how do we feel about Ditch Brodie as a character? Because you had some really interesting thoughts on that, Rob.
Yeah, I mean, the quickest like sort of comparison I can make is the Jack Burton character from Big Trouble in Little China, where he's essentially the least capable person in the entire story, right? Which I personally, and I think maybe this is something you're bumping up against, but I personally think that adds a level of tension to the story because he doesn't seem capable, right? Which heightens the danger of every scenario that they find themselves in. But I also think it in some ways makes him super relatable, right? If he was just utterly, the
capable. Everyman thing again, right?
Yeah.
It's a little bit of Die Hard, you know?
Exactly.
Totally.
Right.
Yeah. And I think like down to, you mentioned the film noir plotting, but down to like he figures out one thing and he ends up at her apartment, and in like classic film noir sense, the killers are already there and they try to take him out, and that's when he realizes there's like a lot more going on here than I realized, right?
Yeah.
And he also has this really interesting, very unusual and quite original backstory of that he was an Olympic gymnast
with a bad haircut.
I love this, which again I think goes
to really interesting.
Yeah, it flips the gender roles. It's like he's a gymnast, right? Like that would, I think at that time especially, would have been a sort of a detail assigned to a female character, and it's not here.
Though we are in that moment of like great American male and female gymnasts, like the early 90s, and so like it. I don't disagree with you. I actually kind of went like, I feel like this is sort of unusual. But then thinking about the early 90s and what we were watching on TV, like when we watched it, and the Olympics were such a big deal then.
Well, what I like about it as well is that it ties it into the real world politics of the U.S. boycott. And how he was personally sort of a victim of circumstance, and his Olympic dreams were crushed because he wasn't able to compete in, was it the 84 Olympics? Is it the 84 Olympics?
I mean, you've seen the movie 40 times.
I think it is the 84 Olympics.
Yeah. So I think that was
and
really
that crushed dreams thing that comes along with being the like PI or the noir character. You have to have like a past that's turned you into like
slightly broken figure.
Yeah. And one thing I do want to say too about that I think is actually really unique about the character is he's a skydiving instructor, and that plays such a vital role to him getting in and out of trouble. And a lot of the movies that, I love, like it's usually just a general set of skills. Like these heroes are ultra capable. They're just badasses. He's not. The thing he's good at, skydiving, is the thing that constantly gets him in and out of trouble throughout the movie. And I think the movie's really clever about him escaping from the power plant using skydiving.
Right.
Helping her at the end of the movie using skydiving. Everything is built around that specific detail.
He has one thing that he's really good at.
Yeah.
Right.
And he uses that to sort of get him out of jams.
He's also just kind of like, everyone looks at him and like Margaret Colin, who's in this movie for not enough time.
Took me a minute to like,
I love
like
Margaret Colin.
Haircut.
She just looks so different.
She's about to be an Independence Day, like a year later or something like that. But like, she's just kind of like with this guy. And I like everyone knows he's a joke. Yeah. Like he's kind of a washed up buffoon, like who makes money skydiving incorrectly into what he thinks are bachelorette parties. Yeah. Like, and Charlie Sheen is great in this movie.
I agree.
It's the most I'm not a huge Charlie Sheen guy. I'll be honest. Like your dad, I think it sounds like.
Yeah, maybe.
This is the most appealing he's ever been.
Yeah.
Like, maybe Platoon and then this.
Young Guns.
Young
Guns.
Okay, that's
Young
a good
Guns.
one.
Well, why don't we? I'd love to have this conversation about Charlie as an action hero because there's a line in this film where, and this is rather unpleasant, so forgive the misogyny of the line, but Christopher McDonald says, "One day this bitch is going to run out of lives." And I feel like Charlie Sheen has had 9 lives as an actor, right? Started off as sort of teen heartthrob,
right.
Then a serious actor in Oscar-winning movies like Platoon, which is probably his best ever work, extraordinary in that film. Then followed up immediately with Wall Street. Then started doing the spoof comedies and was kind of a goofball in films like Hot Shots or Men at Work with his brother.
I love Men at Work.
doing those kind of movies.
Yeah.
And then he had a real run as an action star with like Navy SEALs, The Rookie, this movie and The Chase, and he was even
The Chase.
was one of the studio's first choices for Speed, which we talked about in that episode, which kind of showed you where Hollywood was at that point, where he was at that point. And he kind of carved out his own niche in the action genre. And I always sort of thought, okay, he tends to be quite glib, but I just rewatched The Rookie, and he's very good in that. And it's a pretty hardcore movie.
Yeah, The Rookie. I watched The Rookie last night. It rules.
The second half of that movie is
dude, there's insane stuff in that movie.
It's really extreme. Like the shots to the head, and it's like I remember it from being a kid.
Oh, it's nihilistic.
Raul Julia, baby. He's so good in it. Well, incredible.
I think that's the only movie in history that had a bigger stunt team than an actual cast, speaking role cast.
Yeah. It's elaborate, especially the freeway stuff. But how do we feel about Charlie as an action hero?
Rob?
I think in this, because of the level of humor that's designed into this experience, I think he's very good in this movie.
Yeah.
It's funny, watching it in the context of okay, he could have been the lead in Speed. I was like, maybe he could have. But I think he brings a level of baggage at that point even, just who he was in his personal life.
He's been famous for so long, right?
Yeah, and I think his troubles were already rearing their head then. In fact, I think during the making of the movie, they were dealing with some of that stuff. And so I think, whereas Keanu Reeves just brings that goodwill of oh man, that's the guy I want saving the cat from my tree. I think Charlie Sheen is I don't know if I want to let this guy into my life.
Absolutely. I was thinking about that because Keanu has an earnestness and a sort of, he comes across as kind of decent and professional, especially in that movie. Even if he starts out when he's in the early scenes in Jack Traven, he's glib at the start of it. But as we talked about, goes on a journey to actually being empathetic and really caring. Whereas Charlie always kind of comes across like everything's a joke.
Charlie is Keanu Reeves in the elevator sequence forever.
Right.
He's never going to get past the imagine him saying, the basement. You could see him saying that. I think that was pretty good, actually. But he could kind of that's about where he is. And I would say that this movie doesn't, as much as I enjoy it, it doesn't sell me on his redemption. I mean, beyond the fact that the idea of an American citizen getting an award in Russia for bravery in 1994 is maybe more possible than a few years before, but it's I texted Phil, I was like, he gets an award in Russia at the end of this movie. But it doesn't quite sell it, but I think that's a function of the ever wisecracking Charlie Sheen.
And he does have some good acting moments. There was one scene in particular which will bring us to our the lady of the film, who's also this sort of co-hero, Nastassja Kinski. There's a great scene with her in the bar, which I thought actually got kind of honest, where they both the sort of personas drop a little bit. She talks passionately about the Cold War and the consequences of it and how that will affect him, and he's basically checked out by that point. It's a classic kind of character turning point of I'm not going to be a hero. I'm done.
He turns his back before the third act.
But he's actually pretty good in that scene, and she is she's a very interesting, speaking of Hollywood lineage, right? Let's move on to our section on the lady and talk about Nastassja Kinski as Chris Morrow. Famous father again.
Very famous father.
Had been in art house stuff and had been a model. She's playing Russian. She's actually German, right?
German-Polish. Mother's Polish.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
But, as we were talking about earlier, wasn't really had been in Paris, Texas, classic. Cat People,
amazing
cult classic. Weird movie. But not the most obvious choice in this film. But what are your thoughts on her as this character?
It's interesting. I think I kind of said this to you earlier, Phil, when we were talking about it, is I simultaneously think she's just hugely miscast, but also very good in the movie, which is such a weird sort of contradiction, but that's how I feel. She is so remarkable in Paris, Texas. It is an incredible performance.
She's that movie's amazing.
She's amazing.
That scene toward the monologue towards the end is unbelievable.
It's an incredible performance.
Yeah.
And that she's capable of these things. And to your point, that scene in the bar in this movie, she makes it work, and they find a rapport there that's believable. But that said, and I don't think this is is there a lot of chemistry between them? I don't know. It kind of flits in and out for me.
Yeah.
But I do think she's miscast, but I think she's very convincing in this movie. And I think the physical quality of the role, I think she actually really sells it. I think she's very good.
Yeah, she's good. And she looks like a movie star. She is especially in this era of what a movie star is. I sort of wish that this is a bigger thing about the movie. So there's a moment where in the scene right before where she goes into the photo booth and takes her picture, and I was kind of like, what's she doing? Like, what is this happening? I kind of wish at the end of the movie, all of the KGB coup stuff was a lie. Right. Like, I really want this movie to. I know this.
You wanted it to be
I wanted a downer of an ending. Yeah. I really wanted it to be like, I tricked you, because that feels like it would make the most sense, as opposed to sort of the late stage redemption. Like when Gandolfini stabs her, I was like, oh God, we're gonna go for it. Yeah. Like, this is gonna get dark, and then it doesn't, which is but then. Well, a lot of different things to cover there. Like, it both is satisfying, but I'm also like, I wanted stupidly. I was like, why can't Terminal Velocity be darker as like a PG-13 movie?
Something I would say. Yeah. Again, we're face-offing again.
Yeah. This isn't her, but there's her roommate sort of who dies in the cold open of the movie is super badass. Like, she's kicking everybody's ass in that opening, and there was part of me that wished that some of those opportunities were afforded Nastassja Kinski to literally kick ass.
Yeah.
Like, and by the way, just to speak, I think that opening's incredibly dark.
Yeah.
Like, the movie doesn't go any darker than that, but I'm like, wow.
Shadows are the beginning of Lethal Weapon in that movie.
Right, the opening shot and everything.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, where does she fit in the evolving 90s landscape of these kick-ass female characters that we're now starting to see? Because up until recent times, female characters have kind of been given short shrift in a lot of these action movies, but we're starting to see the tide turning, right? With Annie in Speed, played by Sandra Bullock, with Helen Tasker in True Lies.
Well, that's the most obvious corollary, right? I think, is that she's kind of Helen Tasker's kind of a badass.
What are your thoughts on that?
I mean, it's funny, even looking at the movies you guys have covered up to this point, including True Lies and Speed, but even going back to Narrow Margin, where, like, you have a wonderful actress like Anne Archer who's really sort of relegated to a backseat role. Like, this just shows, I think, an evolution of what's possible. And it's sad that this is the state of affairs in 1994, but this is really a juicy role. And it's an opportunity for a woman to really be a marquee name and a marquee role in an action thriller. And I think she's really good in it, and I think without this, I mean, obviously you have Thelma and Louise before, right? But without this, I don't know if you get, Gina Davis in Cutthroat Island or Long Kiss Goodnight, obviously Linda Hamilton before this and Sigourney Weaver as Ripley, but in terms of this movie, like this kind of paradigm,
I guess that makes me wonder, like, what the actual cultural impact of this movie is, right? Because, like, it doesn't, among the films we've covered, it doesn't feel like the most remembered, but I also think, speaking to the Hollywoodness, Deran Sarafian of it and all, like, people saw this movie, and like, you saw it opening night, and, like, I think we can't sell short that just because this is such a golden age of action movies, like, this period, that, like, you can't really sell short the influence of it. But
it was lost. Like it's lost in the shuffle of too many superior action films. I think
that's correct.
I would say, right? Like, it's just, this was a film that maybe some people saw on video. You saw it at the movies, but for most people, there's just too much.
It feels like a video store hit.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean,
it's too many other bigger, better studio movies that are just dominating that landscape.
I mean, imagine being, like, even me coming on this podcast in the wake of True Lies and Speed, and it's like talking about Terminal Velocity in the wake. I mean, Speed in particular is such a cornerstone of the genre, and True Lies is right behind it, in my opinion. Like, coming out in the wake of those, I don't think anything was.
Well, I think it's funny you say that, because it feels like, when I saw the date on this, which is 1994, I was like, 94? This feels like a 91, 92 action movie. Like, you can feel more sophisticated things happening at the same time. And I have no idea how long this is in development. I have no idea when it was written. Maybe you do. But, like, it does feel like a little behind the curve. Like, tonally to me.
It's also interesting that this was part of the trend, and maybe one of the first ones of the trend that would continue throughout the 90s, when there are two movies about an almost identical subject.
Yeah.
Right.
This being just a couple months, I think, ahead of Drop Zone, which we will cover, which I saw at the movies and absolutely love. And I have to say, I'm sorry, Rob, we'll duke this out, but I'm team Drop Zone on this.
Yeah, I'm gonna get going. Well, I'll see you guys.
Well, it's funny.
You can referee, Liam.
Yeah, exactly.
The question I have for you guys, and it's funny, Speed might be the sort of antidote to what I'm suggesting, but if this had two different leads, two different actors from that era, do you think we're talking about a different success?
I have a thought on that, because the movie that this was basically remade later, and to some extent with Tom Cruise and Cameron Diaz as Night and Day.
Jinx.
Which personally I didn't think worked.
Okay.
Actually,
me neither.
What happens in that one?
who knows?
Very similar.
It's
she's
lighthearted
the
spy shit. You know, it's just got it's got no weight to it. Light spy stuff. But to me, like Cameron Diaz was actually popping off around this time in The Mat. If she had played this role, this could have been it'd be interesting.
Nick Cage is maybe Ditch Brodie.
Boom! Now it's a cult classic.
Yeah, that's what I would.
Right?
He was the only name I could. Sorry, I bumped.
Yeah,
he was the only name I could think of. Because you're right, there was a very limited amount of people in this age bracket at that time that could carry an action movie.
Yeah, that's true.
It was now Keanu Reeves, Charlie Sheen, and maybe Nick Cage.
I'm just trying to
Cruise.
think.
Because they were trying out. This is what Hollywood do in this era with trial balloon actresses like Christy Swanson in The Chase. Charlie's like the action movie he made later that year.
Yeah.
She kind of has a moment, and then it doesn't necessarily like launch into the stratosphere. Stays around, does some decent work.
I think the challenge to come back to the lady with
hard
this
to
is
find.
Who's the person that can cover the European-ness of it? And this is an era when it's like, you're European, cool, do a Russian accent. It's fine.
Raul Julia's playing a German in the Rookie.
Yeah,
right? Even though
Gandolfini's playing the Russian in this,
I was about to say.
Hollywood's almost like you're not American. You can play anything you want, like
100%.
mix and match.
But yeah, I mean that's the thing is I think that it needs someone like Nastassja Kinski in this part because of the Russia of it or that quality. So it's like you couldn't really replace her with a Cameron Diaz. I would also argue that Cameron Diaz is a little too flighty as a performer. Not like she kind of has this manic energy with the mask and all these things that like I think this movie needs a kind of like exotically, sort of from a Hollywood perspective, someone mysterious and kind of exotic about her like Europeanness that's a weird contrast with Charlie Sheen because he's so like, he's kind of cynical and he's like, I was saying he's like cynically earnest.
Yeah.
Like you don't get a lot of like, he's a good actor, don't get me wrong, but like especially as playing Ditch Brodie, he's like there's not like a lot going on behind the hood, which is what part of what works in the portrait of the character.
Sort of whole thing is like I have a wall up, right?
Yeah,
and the wall
that's true.
is being glib and cynical, but actually underneath it, someone's deeply vulnerable.
Yeah,
and actually I think that probably echoes maybe who he is in real life. Everything's a joke, and sort of what it subsequently became a national event, an international kind of moment, and it was almost like an extension of that happening in real life.
The other thing I wanted to say, and I kind of said this to you, but I think as much as I love the movie, if I were a marketing executive, I think I would be really discouraged because I think the movie has a premise, but it doesn't have a concept, right? Speed has the bus. Die Hard has the building. True Lies has My Husband's a Secret Agent. This doesn't have a higher concept. And so when you watch the trailer, which I was watching this morning,
well said.
It's like it's not entirely clear what it's selling beyond the skydiving action. And I think, and it gives away the big reveal that she's faked her death in the trailer.
Yes.
So it also almost doesn't have a ticking clock to come back to. Right. Like it until the plane takes
off. Before who a big
like there's
bucket
no
of who
momentum
cares, right?
that feels like
it's too nebulous, right? It's basically we need to get the gold. To be fair, we need to get this gold, but to prevent a coup being financed that would destabilize the Russian government and potentially put like people who are hostile to the West in power. But again, that even saying that speaks to the convoluted nature that goes against what was hip at that time, which is high concept. There's a bomb on the bus. What do you do?
Well, it's just so
really
high
clean concepts that are concise and like grabbers.
And sometimes like when we think about like the golden age of superhero stuff, like the past few years, like they're playing around and experimenting with things that like are kind of outside of what like most people would consider a superhero movie. Like you train your audience and you make them knowledgeable enough. And I feel like that's happening in this period with action movies from a maybe Demolition Man, Last Action Hero on. It's like we can Loaded Weapon, like action movie, but make it a spoof, right? Like we've started doing this genre long enough now that we can mess around. And this feels like right down the middle, which isn't a bad thing. But again, it feels like a couple years too late. But it is one of those
script. When I sometimes see this and I'm like, oh, I get why this script sold for a lot of money. Like the set pieces, the trailer moments.
The action rocks. And it's, like I said, it's specific. Like his character has a specific skill set that is used frequently. Like it's very
exciting to look at.
Yes. It's lovely, but it's like you guys are gonna do The Rock. Even Long Kiss Goodnight has the amnesia concept. And I personally think the concept of this is that she is the real hero of the movie, but the marketing materials and even the movie almost backs away from that at a certain point.
Yeah.
Well said. Phil, how's your Gandolfini? Can I hear it? It's a tough one, right?
That
Can
is,
you do your Gandolfini
I don't
with
know
a Russian
I don't know that I
accent?
have it, but what I will say is that I love this character's name, Ben Pinkwater.
Oh, yeah.
I actually did remember that from when it came out because that was just a great.
Hey, David, quick, we got to have a character name for James Gandolfini.
He's drinking lemonade.
Looks at a picture of Big Ben, a Ben. And then, he's a cocktail, Pinkwater.
So James Gandolfini plays two characters, Ben Pinkwater in quotes and Stefan. So he's masquerading as a district attorney who is sort of seems kind of clueless and nerdy.
Also kind of a creep.
Yeah.
Like maybe a creep.
Yeah, a little bit untrustworthy, a bit slippery, but seems he's playing a sort of low statusy kind of version. He's not like the district attorney that's coming in like really buttoned up and is like, I'm here to bust you. He's weirdly, supposedly on his side, and then he's revealed ultimately to be a Russian gangster, mafioso.
But still with a New Jersey accent.
Called Stefan.
Like, you're really screwing this up for me. What? Why are you talking? Why aren't you speaking Russian?
Thoughts on this?
I love
this
James
character?
Gandolfini. I think he's great in everything he does.
I think the big discovery of the movie, and it's not a discovery now, but the discovery is Gandolfini. I think he takes...
Is this before True Romance? No, it's after True
Deran
Romance.
and Sarafian told me he cast him because of...
He's incredible in True Romance.
In True Romance.
Yeah.
And a tough scene to play. Kills it. And here I think he's actually... There's a scene where he and Charlie Sheen are sharing certs with each other.
That's the best bit.
Would you like a
so
cert?
fun.
And you're pretty much ahead of the movie at that point, that this guy's not what he says he is. And he almost convinces you that you're wrong in that scene because he's so good.
He is really good.
And I wish the movie did more with him and his relationship with her, because it hints at something.
Yeah, that he really likes her. He respects her a lot. He's possibly in love with her. There are moments and things that he says about. He says this line to Ditch, like, "She's more of a man than you'll ever be." Unpack that.
The whole movie's doing this.
I didn't pick up on that.
There's a movie, a bit where he smacks her on the ass, and then she does it back to him later. Like, the whole movie is playing with the gender. It's conscious of this gender role. And that line literally just punctuates it, which is she's more of a man than you ever will be.
Yeah. It's an interesting performance. I think it's hard for us because I can't turn the clock back and remember when Gandolfini was a discovery, right? Like I don't know when you saw it. Do you remember if were you taken in by it when you first saw it? Because now we have all the baggage of all his iconic roles and incredible actor. Rest in peace.
He's too good of an actor to not be. I was taken in by it a little bit, but I kind of knew because I had read about the movie, maybe I'd looked at the document before or something like that. But I was like, I was kind of bummed out. But also, there's a little bit of a talent in the performance, but he's just too good of an actor to not be taken in by him.
Well, and I think the physicality, he's so physically threatening in True Romance, and he feels imposing in this movie.
Well,
once you reveal his sort of true nature, I actually didn't think the final confrontation, he's very menacing.
Yeah.
Because he seems so much bigger.
Well, he feels like someone that could beat the shit out of anybody, I wouldn't want to make him mad, even though for all accounts he was the nicest biggest teddy bear in the entire world.
And a deep thinker and an intellectual.
He's about to play one of his great roles though in Crimson Tide, where he's just the biggest. He every time I watch that movie, I'm like, I punched this guy in the face.
But I will say, in terms of Die Hard, you have Hans masquerading as one of the hostages, and I think it's that the device is used more effective in Die Hard because of the dramatic irony. Here, once it's revealed that he isn't who he says he is, I agree with you, Phil. I don't think it lands the way the movie probably wants it to. And I don't think that's his fault.
Well, and also, classic, in Die Hard, it's classic because there's 3 layers of knowledge. The audience knows who Hans is. Bruce Willis might know who Hans is. That scene is the suspense is in playing with our knowledge. It's very McTiernan Shakespeare. I'm letting you in. The dramatic irony is all over the place in that. Whereas here, it's kind of comparatively underdeveloped, which I think is a good way to think about this in relation.
The shame of it is that Ben Pinkwater is a more interesting character than Stefan.
That's
well
great.
said.
The fake persona is actually more nuanced and interesting than the real guy, which is a shame.
Might be almost interesting if he just tags along and is kind of like the third wheel, and they're sort of as the capitalist
when they're making out.
Well, I think that's a really interesting point because I do think his initial scene where they're walking around a pool table, he, for lack of a better term, blows Sheen off the screen. Like, he just handles him. He's just he's such a presence.
Yeah.
And you can feel Sheen trying to take the power back within the scene, and it's just not getting there.
Yeah.
By the way, the idea of a DA coming to interview him, like this guy who's like suddenly caught in this mystery being interviewed by the police, and the DA, like, that's so film noirish.
Absolutely.
Like, that this guy shows up and like he doesn't.
It's such an interesting prism through which to rewatch this movie and think about it, because I really did love all those Southwestern noirs, and there was a bunch of them at this time, like you were saying.
Western noirs.
White Sands was another one that I love, and Phoenix with Ray Liotta was an interesting one, and The Getaway was in Arizona, the Baldwin basing a remake. Let's move on to the action. And as we just said, you see why this script sold, right? There's trailer moments. There's an incredible final set piece. What are your thoughts on this purely as an action movie? Does this succeed on that level?
Yeah, I mean, I have to give credit to Deran on this one. I think the action is exceptional. Like, I think it's ambitious. I think he chooses incredible locations. And more importantly, I think the sense of geography, where people are in relation to each other as things are happening, is exceptional. And you're a huge Tony Scott fan. I am too. But I think one of the reasons, just to use a reference, The Last Boy Scout, that movie falls down for me is I think the geography makes no sense. And I don't know where people are in relation to anybody. They just run around corners and they're in different places.
Hear that sound, that's the steam coming out of my ears.
Listen, good luck with everything.
I know. But I think there's a tremendous clarity here. And these, like, for instance, when Ditch goes to the apartment, I love that location.
Yeah.
Packed
with stuff.
It's so packed with stuff, and it gives him an escape route. And I love the scene where he has to parachute off of the power plant. I think that's awesome, and it's all practical.
It's also a good example of you as an audience coming to the same conclusion with the characters as they are. Like, this movie is really good about keeping you mostly on Ditch's level, even with the James Gandolfini side. But like in the action scenes, you're kind of moving with him.
Yeah. And that final. This is what we were talking about as it relates to Deran. Like, the movie just is so gleefully absurd. And there's a moment when, in the final set piece, when he pulls the lever on the trunk and it breaks, and you're just like, where is this going to go? And he's like, I have to get the key.
It's incredible.
And you're just like, this is giving me what I didn't even know I wanted.
That sequence is amazing.
I agree.
Like,
it's the best sequence in the film by a mile.
It's so good.
And it's great that they saved the best action set piece for last.
I mean, it's so preposterous, but it's suspenseful in the moment.
Yeah.
I just also think the craft is so good. Like, when they skydive when the sun is going down and like that kind of photography is so hard to get, and I feel like we've all been spoiled by Mission Impossible Fallout, like the Halo jump in that movie, and like how it's this one long take, and like I think that that's impressive as like an audience member, but I'm also a little like always not super into like when I feel like when I'm watching an action movie, I feel like I'm like, yeah. Like, that must have been technically difficult to pull off. And I think you see a lot more of that in movies now, where it's like, look, like the jump in Dead Reckoning. Like, I saw that footage 4 or 5 times, and I was kind of like, okay, cool. But like in the case of this one, it's like, wow, this is just shot and cut like a craftsman shoots and cuts a movie. And it's completely it's kind of like unassuming and simple, but I mean that in the best way, where I'm like going on the adventure.
And there's in Die Hard, the scene I always think about is when he swings in through the glass, the window, and he falls, and then the panel starts to pull him out. Like, it just keeps escalating.
Oh my God, that's the greatest moment in that movie. It's
this
incredible.
Movie's full of little escalations they're so smoothly conceived and edited into it. Like, the finale's great. I mean, Chris McDonald comes out with a shotgun. I mean, it's just, there's so many complications. It is impressive.
Right.
And the movie's full of them, all from the little set pieces to the big ones. It's where the movie really excels. There's a small moment in the airport, in an airplane graveyard, that I think I love. It's just, they're on the plane. There's machine gun fire, and the only way they can think to get out of it is to go up and escape from the top.
And that makes me think of another great Southwestern fun cult action movie, Harley Davidson and the Marlboro Man, which had that great
ding 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 ding.
That's the first time we mentioned it
on the show. We've mentioned it.
I think it's the same. I think it's the same airplane graveyard.
It would make sense, but I'd never seen that location, and it is so cinematic and so creepy and so interesting and weird. So this film does have a good sense of spatial relations and the iconography and imagery. It's a solid action film, but that end sequence is a banger. I do want to move on to the humor, because I have one specific question, because we skim over this section because, well, oh yeah, there's some funny shit in it, but this one is this is fundamental to me, and I have a question for you guys, right? So films like Die Hard and Speed are actually hilarious throughout, yet we never lose any sense of the stakes, or they're never like an action comedy. This to me is kind of more of almost like a comedy thriller. My question is there such a thing as a film being too funny?
It's a good question. And anyway,
I think that's a good question about tone. It depends on the tone of the movie, right? Like Starship Troopers, directed by Paul Verhoeven. Ding, 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 ding.
Yay.
We have to do it every time.
Well, even RoboCop too.
Or RoboCop, like the humor's like it sticks in your throat a little bit. So the humor's like perfect. Or like the humor in, I think Lethal Weapon is a great example of this, because Lethal Weapon 1 is funny when it's funny and serious when it's serious, and Gibson is so perfect at being funny and like serious at the same time. But by the fourth movie, it's essentially a Three Stooges routine. And I think they kind of earned that by that point in the movie's run. But like it does feel like especially by the fourth one, there's this law of diminishing returns in terms of the humor, because you're like, these movies had like a much better tonal balance in one. Even 3, which is not my favorite, there's a much cleaner tonal balance there. And I think, to relate it to the thesis of this show, Die Hard with a Vengeance is really funny because the humor is rooted in the characters, whereas the humor in this is kind of Charlie Sheen shtick. Like, look, I'm Charlie Sheen. Like, I do my Charlie Sheen thing.
And this is my theory on this is like, yeah, it's such a difficult tightrope to walk. As we've just talked about, those two movies are straight action movies that are very serious action films, but they're incredibly funny. Die Hard and Speed, for example, and some of the other examples that you cite, Lethal Weapon, what have you. In this film, I almost feel like because it's so reliant on Charlie Sheen's, the film orbits him, you know what I mean? And because you're beholden to his persona and maybe to his skills and maybe some of his limitations. And as a result, I don't think that you ever really take any of it that seriously.
True.
The stakes don't feel, it's kind of like, well, if the car falls, he'll make a quip.
She's in the trunk, right?
You know, and I know, and it's a brilliant sequence. But there is something about this recipe and the balance of action, comedy, and stakes that is such a delicate stew.
Well, it's totally mismatched.
I think True Lies is a really good comp for this, right? They're both capers, essentially.
Yes.
The difference is I think True Lies has a very relatable entry point, which is Helen. She's someone that we all can know in our real life. You know what I mean? She's a woman who works by day. She's also a housewife. And then, but in this movie, there's no one that's relatable. I mean, these are all characters
you would never meet them.
Never meet them. And so I think the humor never feels like it extends from our experience.
Interesting.
It's kind of passive. And I will admit that, like, as much as I love the movie, it is fully exists in like a heightened reality where there's no, like, Speed is on a daily commute. We all commute every day. Die Hard, same thing. You're in an office building. You know, so
there's also a muscularity to the action in like True Lies, and once you get to the sort of third act in True Lies, the humor takes a back seat. And Lethal Weapon is the same way, and I think Die Hard is largely the same way. Whereas this film actually, by the end of it, it's almost slapstick with that sequence at the Russian ceremony where he's pretending to make them salute and stuff, right? So the tone,
it's like Hot Shots
when the car has been driving, but where it's parked, it has ended in broad comedy, you know. So I just think it's just an interesting thing to pull off because it is just such a difficult skill to master, to have a movie that's action driven, have a lot of humor and comedy without it diluting or bursting the balloon, as it were.
Let me ask you this. Do you think if the romance between the two of them had been more effective, it would have rooted that stuff, or no?
So I actually wanted to talk about this. This was actually something I wanted to jump back and talk about. But the scene where they're like laying in that like remnants of a cabin and they find the bottle of tequila and she gets very drunk and becomes flirtatious is like the worst kind of early 90s like lady, like the lady's just a damsel kind of writing. Like, almost to the point where Charlie Sheen is like, whoa, like, and I just feel like it's almost like, I just found that so like kind of a betrayal
Unearned,
of the
I
character.
felt.
Yeah, it's a betrayal of the character who we've set up at this point.
I mean, it's interesting to this point because I think that would have helped, but they couldn't quite crack this code. Hollywood tried to, because what's happening concurrently with these action movies is the rise of the erotic thriller. And eventually these two they try and marry the two with films like Specialist, Fair Game, which didn't work, which was a Joel Silver.
There's a couple things that work in it, but yeah, ultimately
turn the sound off, it's good.
Yeah.
With Cindy Crawford and William Baldwin, that was very much trying to marry a sort of steamy romance in the midst of a spy caper type scenario. Again, it's like Russian Goons with Steven Berkoff playing the main one. They tried to do this, but they couldn't quite get it right. Also, again, I think to your point, it's actually very hard to get the kind of electric chemistry that you get with, say, Keanu and Sandra Bullock in Speed.
I attest that Speed is the most romantic movie ever made.
So that hugely is a massive help.
That's a really good point. I mean, I think that's a really good point. It is really hard. And I think Speed and Romancing the Stone, I would go back to, does that too, where that movie never loses its stakes, but it's an extremely successful romance.
Well, I also think that, like, it's not about sex, right? Like, Speed isn't about sex. The relationship between them isn't about sex. The Romancing the Stone relationship is a little like His Girl Friday screwball comedy, kind of like constant one-upmanship, right? Like, whereas, like, erotic thrillers are inherently about, like, they're about power dynamics, and they're
often noir. They often have their roots in noir.
So, like, they need to be a little more, like, psychologically dense than this is, and so that's part of the problem, is that tonally, I think sometimes this is almost a screwball comedy.
And the other tricky thing is, now that you're saying that, what's really difficult, if you already have a character that is by his nature, embraces danger and is then drawn into a world of danger, it's not quite as effective or relatable as an everyman being drawn into this world and maybe getting kind of turned on by it in the way that, like, Helen Tasker is in True Lies.
That's true.
Or even, North by Northwest, which I think is
another great comp for this, actually. Yeah.
Well, and I do think
there's a Hitchcockian
there is a Hitchcockian thing. Totally.
I think if I went back and looked at the original script, and it's very clear that he was like, I want to do Vertigo, Rear Window, and North by Northwest.
That makes so much sense.
Yeah, it's very clear.
Yeah. I think the one thing that I would say about, like, the kind of, like, a guy who embraces dangers, one of the things I like about the movie is Charlie Sheen's never scared to jump out of anything because he's a skydiver, right? So it's almost like that. It's weirdly, like, pedestrian, his job for him at the beginning. And it's kind of like when she falls out of the plane, he just dives after her to save her. You know what I mean? So it's like, I agree with you. The problem is that his everyman job is, like, extraordinary to most people, but he does a good job of playing it like an everyman.
I also, just to speak to that, I think that's Sheen. I think it's also David Twohy. And I think if you look at The Fugitive, it's like the lead character is a doctor. And that specific trait is such a huge part of him being able to solve the murder of his wife. But he does it again. And Toohey did this movie with Sheen just 2 years later, or a year later, The Arrival.
The Arrival!
Where he wrote and directed that. And Sheen he's a radio astrologist.
Right. He finds aliens.
Yeah. And if you watch the movie, he uses all the skill sets that are so unique to that job. And it makes the movie fairly fascinating. But even Pitch Black, it's like you have a guy who can see in the dark, and that whole concept of that movie, he's the only character that could survive that scenario. Yeah. It's so specific.
He low-key discovered Vin Diesel, too. I mean, he was in Saving Private Ryan, but, like, he gives him this role. He's incredible in that movie.
And I'll give you one more. He did a movie, directed a movie called A Perfect Getaway. Which, if you haven't seen it, is actually very fun. But the Timothy Olyphant character is essentially a Navy SEAL. He calls himself an American Jedi in the movie. But the skill set of that role is so specific in the movie. And I think it's just something Toohey does in all of his work, is he's very conscious of that. It's not just, I have a badass who's good at everything. It's like, no, I have this trait, like skydiving.
Yeah.
That makes me perfect
that's really
to solve
interesting.
This.
Yeah. And that is a good way to approach character and how character and action are.
Character is action kind of thing.
Exactly.
So you're talking about that with Speed. We don't know that much about these people.
Should we put on our tuxedos and...
I'm going to put on my skydiving outfit.
Parachute down
I'm going to put on my orange jumpsuit and then have someone else someone else sub in here.
All right.
Let's do it.
So we're moving into the Action Movie Awards, a.k.a. the Die Hard Oscars. Our first award is the John McClane Yippee-Ki-Yay Award for Best Line. I had 3 nominees, but feel free to add. The one that I think was most remembered for this film, where Nastassja Kinski says, "I'd be stupid to trust my life with a walking penis," to which Ditch responds, "I'm much more than a walking penis. I'm a flying penis."
Wow.
Then we have, 1994, guys. Would you, I love that bit we were talking about before when Ben Pinkwater, played by Gandolfini, says, would you like a certs? And then goes, don't take them all. that was like great. And then the last one that I had was Ditch's attempt at Russian, which translates as, the buses here don't work. I am an asshole.
Can I introduce one?
Please.
I've always, from when I first saw the movie, I always liked the line, pack your bags, we're going on a guilt trip.
That's a good line.
I always liked it.
That is a good line.
It's kind of become part of the lexicon.
I think I'm going to go with the flying dick line. Oh, really side note, I had a three-legged dog growing up.
There you go.
No way.
So
That's
you
weird.
connected with this on a whole different level.
Yeah.
Well, I'm coming to that actually because... okay, so you're picking. Yeah, I think that's probably the most memorable.
Yeah,
that's the most memorable line, and it is somewhat self-effacing, and it kind of captures the absurd tone of the movie, and the fact, like, don't take any of this shit too seriously.
Yeah.
Even the
he also pulls
sexual
that line
politics.
off. He pulls that line off really well.
It suits his brand. The Hans Gruber Exceptional Thief Award for stealing the film, and the nominees are Nastassja Kinski as Chris Morrow, James Gandolfini as Ben Pinkwater, a.k.a. Stefan. Melvin Van Peebles as Noble, popping up, just like another legend, just like,
casually
in the movie as the pilot of the skydiving school. Rance Howard as Chuck, the helpful biplane pilot that Ditch cons into helping him. And an honorable mention for Tripod, the three-legged dog who may not have stolen the film, but he certainly stole our hearts. Thoughts?
I have a feeling Melvin Van Peebles ended up in this movie because Deran had just directed Gunman with Mario Van Peebles.
I love Gunman.
Yeah,
it's
same year.
Yeah, I think it's great.
Yeah.
It feels so quiet.
Interesting.
He's like,
I've never seen it. I'm aware of his filmography.
Written by Stephen Sommers.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. That's right. No, I like Gunman. It's a lot of fun.
This is hard, but I think I have to go with Gandolfini.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm going to go with, my heart wants me to go with Tripod because I had a three-legged dog named Calvin after Calvin and Hobbes. But my answer is Rance Howard as the helpful pilot, the helpful biplane
He does
pilot.
have a fun little...
Yeah, just because he's fun. Also,
pop.
maybe Melvin Van Peebles being a legend is the right choice because he just kind of shows up for 4 minutes.
I think Gandolfini, for me, would be my pick just because, he does show...
The one thing is, he's like a major
range and-
character in the movie, so I take a little issue with this. Can the major character steal the movie?
The rule is anyone except the lead.
Okay.
Liam.
Well,
We'll get out the Die Hard on a blank rule book. Section
probably
7A.
fucking wrote it.
All right, let's move on to the Dick Thornburg Award for Dick of the movie. And I only have 2 nominees. Usually you're really good at pinpointing these. I've got Charlie Sheen as Ditch Brodie, who is kind of a dick, and Christopher McDonald as Kerr, the blonde angel of death henchman. Could you think of any others? Or in addition to those guys?
No,
it
not
kind of
really.
feels
It's a
like this
tough
film
one.
should be full of dickish
But
characters.
there's not that many people in the movie.
No.
There's only 10 people in the whole film.
No, and
Yeah,
like
it's really-
McDonald has like probably 10 lines
He has
in the movie.
nothing to do.
Yeah,
It's such a waste of
It's very strange.
of him. And this was a time, just speaking about Christopher McDonald for a second, it really did sadden me that he has nothing to do. So he has to sort of over-egg the few moments that he has, like when he's firing the gun at that like refinery and then he like smacks the gun and stuff because he's got nothing to do. His character's got no
Well, you're also
depth.
set up to think he's the main bad before Gandolfini shows up. So like then his role diminishes a little.
But this was
bit.
a year when he was in Quiz Show, like an Oscar caliber movie. He'd been in Thelma and Louise and was very memorable in that. And then Happy Gilmore, I think it's like 2 years later.
Yeah.
He was on a real run of doing some
He's an
really vivid.
incredible
I
actor.
love him. He's
I have
great.
to wonder if he was probably one of the top choices for the Gandolfini role. And then they were like, well,
Actually,
let's put him here.
We just got James Gandolfini.
Yeah, it's just a shame he doesn't have more to do.
I think he might
agree.
pull off the Gandolfini role as well.
I'm sure he
he's
could.
much more chameleonic and Gandolfini, as amazing as he is, maybe this is all hindsight, but it's like he doesn't necessarily transform, right? As incredible as an actor as he was. Whereas McDonald seems a little more like can do anything.
And they keep giving him stuff. It's like the blonde hair. He's got his knife. He's got his red convertible.
They set the convertible up well at the beginning of the
That's
movie.
the one bit of characterization that he had. And it's interesting that then he speaks with like a clearly American accent, but he's Russian, but his American accent is suddenly perfect.
Dude, the accents are like
so
all
I don't
over
know
the
what's
place.
going on there.
So weird.
But who's your pick, guys?
Yeah, Christopher McDonald.
I'm going to go with McDonald, too.
Okay.
Also, the soldiers, the Russian soldiers that keep saluting Charlie Sheen. It's like, get it together, guys.
Now, I don't know if your Marco
Let's do
impression is ready to go, but he's waiting behind the curtain as we introduce the best death category.
No more table! Next time you have a chance to kill someone, don't hesitate.
I want to
I
introduce
didn't look
a new...
at you while you did it, because I feel like in past episodes, that's been an issue.
You can look at me anytime, Rob.
Do you have a favorite diehard terror thief, Rob? From the squad there?
I've always really liked
Tripod,
Theo.
the
I
three
like Theo. I've always liked...
Theo gets a lot of love on this show.
We love Theo.
The quarterback is toast.
Yeah.
He's great. He's so good.
I think that guy's really good in the movie. And
He's really good.
I think he actually does a lot with that, with what is probably an underwritten
I think
role.
he also invented that role. Like, the kind of the smart hacker type. You didn't see as much before that.
Have you guys heard of a film called Die Hard? It's pretty good. All right, I've got 3 deaths. Chris Morrow's death that wasn't. Chris McDonald's Hans Gruber-esque fall. Yet another character falling to their death. Yeah. We've done like 22 movies and like 10 of them involve that. Yeah. And then the one that I love, James Gandolfini's death via windmill.
Oh, that's it. It's that.
Right?
Dude,
that.
I have to tell you, like, when I was rewatching, I was like, the way that is shot, though, I was like, how did they do it? There's literally a shot of him, and maybe it's him or maybe it's a dummy, but getting sucked up, and they cut to it like it's a wide shot, and you're like, how did they do that in the midst of the windmill farm? It's really impressive.
Well, here's
really
what I want to
impressive.
say about this, and this is just me paying off, in classic screenwriter tradition, paying off one of your setups. I wanted the Milo death from Last Boy Scout. I wanted some Moulin Rouge there. I wanted to see the shot of the windmill and the blood splashing.
Movie. It's a PG-13 movie. This may be the first PG-13 movie we've covered.
I was actually trying to work that out because I think the only other one, Hunt for Red October, is actually a PG, but it feels like an R because it's such an adult film. But I think this might be that might be my other issue with it, as I struggle a bit with PG-13 stuff.
Yeah, that's not the Philly special.
Doesn't go hard enough.
It had to be R-rated, right? And the studio was like, we've got to turn this into
Cut the shot of Gandolfini getting ripped apart by the windmill, and you have a PG-13.
It's a great death. Very creative.
Yeah.
Very gruesome.
I loved it, but I am curious, like, if this movie started as an R, and you got to wonder in the wake of Speed and True Lies, like, why not release an R-rated movie?
Or were they going for a different... Were they trying to sort of counter-program, go for a slightly different demographic? Yeah,
it's a good question.
Yeah.
But it's a great death.
We'll take a quick break and then we'll move on to our final section, the Double Jeopardy Trivia Quiz. We'll be right back.
We're back with our Double Jeopardy Quiz. Phil's going to ask us some questions. I hate this part of the show. And he's going to Rob, I guess you get to decide, are we competing or collaborating? It's 100% your call.
Well, we got to compete.
God,
otherwise, we lose the stakes.
Guy who's seen this movie. Guy who's seen this movie 40 times.
Humor works against
What was the name
stakes.
of the assistant editor on Terminal Velocity?
All right, this was actually kind of tricky because I'm having to adapt to some of the things that did come up in the show, but let me do my best here. All right.
Did you have a Margaret Colin question?
I did not.
Oh, bummer.
Okay, let's start with this one. In which satirical spoof of action movies does Charlie Sheen make a deadpan appearance as a helpful valet?
Loaded Weapon.
Is correct.
Wow, you beat me to it. You beat me to it.
Emilio Estevez, you know.
Bruce Willis also makes a cameo appearance in a sequence that spoofs the destruction of Riggs's mobile home.
How do you feel about Loaded Weapon?
I love it.
Yeah,
I really like it. I actually thought about doing it for the show.
That's another show that might be for a different show. Yeah. Yeah,
right.
Rob, I'm taking no prisoners this time.
I noticed.
Yeah,
It was so cutthroat.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. At one point in the film, Ditch drives a 1970 white Dodge Challenger in a homage to which iconic 1971 road movie?
Vanishing Point.
Is correct. We have stakes.
Ow, that hurt
it's
my
1-1.
Yeah.
It's 1-1, bringing us into the final category. All right. It's time for Convoluted Corner. Corner. All right, here we go. The wheel's spinning. I love that. I can see
I just
it.
got stuck.
All right, our final question. A common theme around this film is the notion of famous fathers. The director and the 2 stars both have famous parents. However, supporting actor Rance Howard, who plays Chuck, is also the patriarch of a notable Hollywood family. Can you name at least 3 of his famous descendants?
Should we collab on this one?
Clint Howard.
Clint Howard, Ron Howard, and
Bryce Dallas Howard.
Bryce Dallas Howard.
Is
Forgot about
correct. So
Rob
you
gets
collabed
that. No,
in
Rob
the
gets
end.
that one. Rob gets that one.
I would also...
And Paige Howard as well, by the way, who's also an actress.
There is also another familial connection within the movie. The director's brother plays Christopher McDonald's right-hand man.
Oh, that guy looked familiar.
That's Darren's brother.
Okay. Has he been in anything else? Because he really did look like the guy with the glasses who was smoking.
Yeah,
Is it that guy. Yeah,
that's Darren's brother.
Huh.
One of his
really
two brothers.
familiar.
Yeah,
Huh.
That's cool.
yeah,
I love stuff like that.
It's a family affair.
it is.
Do you guys have any final thoughts on this movie or anything you want to talk about, Rob? Anything going on for you that you want to say? Or
I'm
in
thrilled that
Want to
conclusion?
shout out your dad who showed you the movie?
Oh man, we saw all these. He took me to see Hunt for Red October when I was way too young to understand what the hell that movie was about.
I still don't know if I do. I'm confused.
Yeah, it's a very
intense movie.
labyrinth plot. But I would just say it's a pleasure to talk about this movie because it doesn't, in my opinion, get enough attention. And you can see the reasons why, but I think just on a technical level, it certainly deserves merit. Like, it is extremely well made, and I think it is a worthwhile revisit. And I will also I want to shout out another 1994 lost masterpiece is Martin Campbell's No Escape.
Yeah,
Oh,
I actually put that in the lab. Gave it a look. I gave it some serious consideration. It's a really interesting movie that I liked a lot as a kid.
It doesn't hold up, I know.
It's one of those movies, though, where it's like Ray Liotta, who I absolutely love, especially in this era, but always have, where it's like, is an action hero and it doesn't not work and it doesn't work at the same time. He's really good in the movie, but
He's almost
he never
like he's
did
in a
another
different
action
movie.
Yeah, it just doesn't like quite click.
Who
Even
else
though the
is in
movie is
this
really
movie?
good.
Lance Henriksen.
Yes.
Who's great.
The
and
cover
the villain,
is Ray Liotta with like a missile or something in his
Ernie
hand.
Hudson's in it.
Stuart Wilson is the
Who's
bad guy
amazing
from
in
Lethal
the
Weapon
movie.
3, one of the best things he's ever done.
Yeah.
Great
Lethal Weapon
actor.
3?
No, in this movie.
Oh, in this film.
when he
Okay.
plays
I've never
the-
seen it. I've never
It's
seen
very
it.
Mad Max, and it is quite Die Hardy, but it wasn't kind of quite enough. But yeah, I do dig
This,
that.
by the way,
movie.
is why
I
episodes
like
of the
that
show
movie
cost
a lot.
millions of dollars. We bought Phil a Die Hard lab.
yeah.
It's a big computer in it.
And it vanished like this one did, but it's extremely technically accomplished, and it
Yes.
I think it's missing, like this, a higher concept. Like, look at Escape from New York. You're going into New York to rescue the president, and No Escape, it's just a prisoner in a prison camp. And so you have a premise, but not a concept. And so I think
well
that's a big
said.
reason
Yeah,
Well, yeah, that
your
is
point on
good.
that is very salient.
This is a really enjoyable movie. I had a good time watching it. Good recommendation, Rob. Thanks for
It's
coming and
great
talking
to have
us
you
about
on
it.
as a fan of the movie. We've been looking forward to this for a while to have you on, and it's been lovely to have you.
Yeah, I would just say, working in the business, it's easy to get cynical, and I will say that your podcast is, every time I log in to listen to it, it feels like I'm, I get re-inspired as a fan, and it's really nice. I really enjoy it.
Cool, thank you.
That's
Wow.
lovely to hear.
Aw.
I love that we're ending on a warm and
Let's have Rob
fuzzy
back
note.
at the end of every episode to say that.
Well, we hope you will come back. We have a movie in mind for you that we can talk about. But anything else before we say farewell? There was one thing I wanted to mention, but
You just cut me off. You just
go ahead.
No, just kidding. Listen, if you haven't, rate, review, subscribe to the show. Most importantly, tell your friends, tell your dad. Rob, tell your dad. You can find me on Twitter at Liam G. Billingham. The show is DieHardOAB. Email us at diehardoab@gmail.com. No new reviews this week. Get on it, you guys.
You can follow me on Twitter at Philip Gawthorne.
Phil, all Phil does is tweet now. He's just
non-stop
tweeting,
Xing.
just Xing,
Triple
a
Xing.
lot of NFT content on there.
There is one thing I do want to mention, which I just want to give a shout out to my friend's podcast, my friend Andy Majorano, who has a podcast called The Andyplex. We met at the Underwater premiere. He was a good friend of John Gallagher Jr., the actor who was in that movie and has been on his show talking about The Shining. They do a wonderful deep dive on The Shining. And I was just on his show talking about Michael Bay's Ambulance because I'm going to have to wait like 5 years to talk about it on this show, and I just couldn't keep it in.
Yeah,
so check out the Andyplex and my appearance. I think it's called Call the Ambulance, I think was the name of the episode.
Next time on the show, The River Wild.
Yeah.
You a fan?
Oh, yeah. Dad took me to see that one too for my birthday.
Mine too. Yeah. I saw it opening night. I think with my mom too, because it was a big.
I went with my mum and dad too. It's interesting because we're
monumentous-
now starting to, speaking of the rise of the female action hero, this is a really important one because this is the first female action lead that we've done. And by the way, it's Meryl Streep, the greatest actress of all time.
And a great villain performance that was nominated for like a Golden Globe.
He's incredible. He's incredible.
Kevin Bacon,
movie, yeah.
And David Strathairn in the movie. It's going to be a great one to discuss, and we've got an awesome guest up our sleeve as well.
We
Actually,
do. Two guests.
So look out for that one.
We'll be back next time with 2 female FBI agents, I guess.
Fantastic. Great. Love it.
That was a lot of fun.
Die Hard on a Blank is a podcast created and hosted by Philip Gawthorne. Liam Billingham co-hosts and produces the show. Mike Mayer and Michael Sugar are the executive producers. Find us on Twitter and Instagram at DieHardOAB. Rate, review, follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Most importantly, tell your movie podcast-loving friends about Die Hard on a Blank. Special thanks to Suki Chu. See you next time on Die Hard on a Blank.
Brace yourself for something fuel-nominal. Unleaded 88 is the clear fuel choice. It's cheaper, cleaner, and greener. And it's grown by Iowa corn farmers. Now that's totally worth the hype. So pump it up with Unleaded 88.